The music echoed across the empty hall, notes of swing and jazz drifting through open windows into the warm summer evening. Sergeant James Donovan stood in the doorway, watching as a dozen uniformed men swept the wooden floor, arranging folding chairs along the walls, hanging colored paper streamers from the rafters. Outside, beyond the chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, cornfields stretched toward the horizon, golden in the fading light. The gramophone on the corner spun steadily, Glenn Miller's orchestra filling the space with sounds that seemed to chase away the shadows of war, if only for a few hours. Donovan checked his watch. 7:30. Soon the trucks would arrive from town, bringing young women from nearby farms and factories, daughters and sisters of men fighting across the ocean. And then, in a moment that defied everything he'd been taught about war, his German prisoners would join them for a night of dancing.
"Are we really doing this, Sarge?" Private Wilson asked, adjusting the last of the paper lanterns. "Letting the Nazis dance with our girls?" Donovan nodded slowly, remembering the directive from command. Morale, rehabilitation, demonstration of American values, all wrapped in bureaucratic language that couldn't possibly capture the strangeness of what they were about to witness. How could anyone explain this scene to the boys fighting in Europe, where brothers and friends fell to German bullets? What would they think of enemy soldiers stepping onto a dance floor with American women while the war still raged? Did such moments of shared humanity undermine the very purpose of conflict, or did they somehow transcend it? "Orders are orders," Donovan replied, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. "Camp 277 will host a dance tonight, and every Saturday night until further notice." The first truck rumbled through the gates at precisely 8 o'clock, carrying 20 young women in cotton dresses, their hair styled in victory rolls, lipstick bright even in the dim light. They chatted nervously, glancing toward the barracks where the prisoners waited. Most had never spoken to a German before, let alone danced with one. The second truck arrived minutes later, this time carrying prisoners, 30 men, selected for good behavior, their uniforms pressed, hair combed neatly, eyes wide with disbelief. The guards had made the rules clear: respectful behavior only, no politics, no wandering from the hall. Yet even these boundaries seemed impossibly generous to men who had expected bullets, not ballrooms, when they surrendered. As the prisoners filed into the hall, an awkward silence fell. The music continued, but nobody moved. Two groups stood on opposite sides of the room, separated by wooden floor and deeper chasms of language, loyalty, and war. Donovan watched, wondering if the experiment would fail before it began. Then Helen Miller, the baker's daughter, stepped forward and extended her hand to a tall, blonde prisoner. The German hesitated, looking to the guards as if expecting a trap, before finally taking her hand. They stepped onto the floor, moving uncertainly at first, then finding the rhythm. One by one, other couples joined them, and the strange dance began. Enemies becoming partners in a moment that would leave both sides questioning everything they thought they understood about their foe. Nobody knew then that this unlikely scene would repeat itself across America, as thousands of German prisoners encountered kindness where they expected cruelty, abundance where they anticipated hunger, and humanity where they had been taught to find only monsters. What began that night would gradually transform not just how they saw Americans, but how they understood the war, their leaders, and themselves, a dance of realization that continued long after the music stopped. The journey that brought German prisoners to American dance halls began months earlier, across thousands of miles of ocean and battlefields. Most arrived from North Africa or the European front, men who had marched under swastika banners with absolute conviction in final victory. Their indoctrination had been thorough. Years of propaganda describing Americans as degenerate, undisciplined mongrels, their military weak, their society corrupting. Capture, they were told, meant certain death or worse, torture in the hands of vengeful Jews and Negroes who dominated the American ranks. Some officers chose suicide rather than surrender. Others prepared themselves for brutality, hardening their hearts against what they believed would come. When the transport ships docked at American ports, many prisoners stood on deck, eyes narrowed against the glare of sunlight on water, bodies tense with dread.
They expected to be paraded through streets, beaten by angry crowds, perhaps executed once the Red Cross observers departed. What greeted them instead was efficient, almost impersonal processing. No crowds gathered to jeer. Guards looked bored rather than vengeful. The prisoners were fingerprinted, photographed, assigned numbers, and loaded onto trains bound for camps scattered across the American heartland. Private Hans Müller, formerly of the 21st Panzer Division, described those first moments in his secretly kept diary. "We prepared ourselves for death. The officers had told us Americans torture prisoners, especially SS. Yet the guards barely speak to us. They gave us cigarettes and coffee on the ship. I keep waiting for the mask to fall, for the true face of the enemy to reveal itself. When will the suffering begin?" The trains carried the prisoners deep into America, through landscapes that contradicted everything they had been told about the country. Cities glowed with light, untouched by bombing. Automobiles filled highways. Well-fed civilians went about their business, showing little interest in the passing trains filled with enemy soldiers. The prisoners pressed their faces to windows, unable to reconcile these scenes with the struggling America their propaganda had described. Where were the breadlines, the civil unrest, the crumbling infrastructure? Most shocking were the illuminated towns. In Germany, strict blackout rules had plunged cities into darkness each night, windows covered with heavy curtains to hide from Allied bombers. Here, neon signs blazed above theaters. Street lamps lined broad avenues. Even farmhouses glowed in the distance, as if immune to the dangers that haunted European nights. The prisoners watched this casual display of electricity with growing unease. If America could afford to light its smallest towns during wartime, what did that reveal about its true industrial capacity? When the trains finally stopped at camps in Texas, Oklahoma, Iowa, Georgia, and dozens of other states, the prisoners found not the dreaded death camps of rumor, but organized facilities with wooden barracks, mess halls, and even recreation areas. Guards carried weapons but rarely threatened. The barbed wire and watchtowers made escape difficult, but inside the fences, a strange normalcy prevailed. 3 meals daily, showers with hot water, medical care for the sick, libraries with German books, even sports equipment for soccer matches between barracks. "They feed us better than we ate in the Wehrmacht," wrote Corporal Werner Schmidt in a letter later censored before reaching his family in Dresden. "Meat every day, white bread, coffee with real sugar. The Americans throw away more food than we received in monthly rations. I cannot understand why they waste such abundance on enemies." The prisoners waited for the cruel twist, the moment when American generosity would reveal itself as elaborate deception. Yet days passed, then weeks, with the same routine. Roll call, meals, work assignments, free time in the yard. The expected brutality never materialized. Instead, something far more disorienting emerged. A system so abundant it could afford to treat prisoners with basic humanity. For men raised in the deprivation of wartime Germany, this casual generosity proved more devastating to their worldview than any punishment could have been. What unsettled them most was not what they found within the camps, but what they glimpsed beyond the fences, evidence of American prosperity that defied their most fundamental beliefs about the war itself. The dance was simply the culmination of 1,000 smaller revelations that had begun from the moment they set foot on American soil. The first dance at Camp 277 near Mason City, Iowa, unfolded with awkward steps and careful distance. The German prisoners, mostly young men in their 20s, moved stiffly, as if expecting the music to stop, the guards to laugh at their gullibility, the pleasant evening to collapse into punishment. The American women, daughters of farmers and factory workers, maintained polite smiles that rarely reached their eyes. How could they truly relax with men whose comrades might have killed their brothers or boyfriends overseas? The guards watched from the perimeter, hands near holsters, uncertain themselves about this strange experiment in wartime diplomacy. Gradually, as the evening progressed, something shifted. The music continued. Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, familiar to both Germans and Americans. Some prisoners who had studied English before the war began hesitant conversations. Others relied on smiles, nods, the universal language of gesture. The wooden dance floor, freshly polished for the occasion, reflected the colored lights strung across the ceiling. Outside, through open windows, fireflies blinked in the summer darkness. Corn rustled in gentle breezes, and the war seemed impossibly distant. Sergeant Donovan noticed Erich Hoffman, a former Wehrmacht radio operator captured in Sicily, dancing cautiously with Sarah Jenkins, whose older brother had been wounded at Anzio. Their steps followed the rhythm of Moonlight's serenade, faces serious, concentrating on movement, rather than the impossible circumstances that had brought them together. "May I ask something, miss?" Hoffman's accent was thick, but his words clear. "Why do you come to dance with German soldiers? We are your enemies." Sarah hesitated, the question hanging between them like an unexploded shell.
"Finally," she answered, "my mother says hating people you've never met is what started this mess. Said I should see for myself what Germans are like." "And what do you see?" Hoffman asked, his expression carefully neutral. "Just people," she replied, surprising herself with the simplicity of the answer. "Different language, same feet to step on mine." This exchange, overheard by Donovan as he passed, captured the cautious curiosity emerging on both sides. The prisoners, expecting American savagery, instead encountered young women who brought homemade cookies and asked about their families. The women, expecting to meet monsters, found awkward young men who blushed when complimented and worried about their mothers back in bombed cities. Neither side knew how to fully reconcile these personal encounters with the broader narrative of global conflict. By the evening's end, the rigid separation had softened, though not disappeared. Laughter occasionally broke through the nervous conversation. A few prisoners with musical training gathered around the piano, playing German folk songs that drew appreciative audiences. When the clock struck 11, guards announced the dance's end, and the women boarded trucks to return to town. The prisoners were marched back to barracks, many looking over their shoulders as if unable to believe what they had experienced. In the darkness of the barracks, the whispered conversations began, urgent, confused, reaching for explanations that could make sense of this unexpected kindness. Why would Americans allow enemy soldiers to dance with their women? Was it a propaganda tool, a psychological experiment, or something more unsettling? Evidence that America felt so secure in its eventual victory that it could afford to treat prisoners with such incredible leniency. The dance itself became less important than what it represented. A society so confident, so resource-rich, that even in wartime it could spare time, space, and trust for social events with captured enemies. This realization prompted questions that ran far deeper than the evening's entertainment. Questions about the nature of the conflict, the truth behind years of propaganda, and the growing certainty that Germany could never match such overwhelming abundance. "I did not understand until tonight," Lieutenant Karl Brenner whispered to his bunkmate. "We are not just fighting an army. We are fighting a world where even enemies dance together on Saturday nights. How can the Reich stand against such strength?" As the prisoners drifted to sleep, the gramophone's melodies lingered in their minds, American rhythms seeping into German dreams, the first notes of a transformation that would continue through captivity and beyond, carrying unexpected harmony into the discord of war. The dances became weekly events at Camp 277 and dozens of other prison camps across America. What began as an experiment in morale management soon evolved into something more meaningful, a cultural exchange in the midst of global conflict. The awkwardness of those first encounters gradually gave way to anticipation. Prisoners volunteered for extra work details to earn dance privileges. They practiced English phrases, combed their hair with greater care, and some even crafted small gifts from camp materials: wooden carvings, sketched portraits, handkerchiefs embroidered with careful stitches. For men who had spent years surrounded by military discipline and masculine hardship, these evenings offered a forgotten softness, the scent of perfume, the rustle of cotton dresses, voices that asked questions rather than barked orders. Many had been teenagers when the war began, their development from boys to men occurring entirely within the rigid framework of Nazi Germany.
Now, in the strange sanctuary of captivity, they encountered parts of themselves long suppressed by conflict and ideology. Kurt Weber, a tank commander from the Afrika Korps, wrote in his journal, "Tonight I danced the waltz as my father taught me before the war. For 3 minutes, I remembered myself as I once was. Not soldier, not prisoner, just a young man holding a pretty girl's hand. The music ended, and I returned to reality, but something remained. Some piece of the old Kurt that I thought had died in the desert." The American women who attended these dances came for various reasons. Some from curiosity, others from loneliness with local men overseas, many from a sense of patriotic duty when authorities explained the rehabilitation purpose. Their reactions varied. Some refused to dance with Nazis regardless of official encouragement. Others found themselves surprised by the humanizing effect of conversation, however limited by language barriers. "I expected monsters," Eleanor Hayes told the camp chaplain after her 3rd visit. "My fiancé is fighting in France, and I came ready to hate them. But they're just boys, most of them, homesick, scared, confused by everything American. One showed me a picture of his mother that he keeps in his shoe. How do I reconcile that with what they've done in Europe?" The chaplain had no easy answer. The contradiction she identified lay at the heart of the dance program itself, the impossible task of separating individual humanity from collective responsibility. Guards struggled with similar questions, watching young men who seemed ordinary, even likable during recreational hours, while remembering the ideology they had served and the atrocities committed in its name. These dances revealed more than cultural differences. They exposed fundamental contradictions in how both sides understood the conflict. The Germans, shaped by propaganda describing Americans as degenerate and weak, instead found disciplined efficiency, technological advancement, and material abundance that defied imagination. The Americans, expecting to find fanatical Nazi monsters, discovered ordinary young men who shared pictures of girlfriends and learned American dance steps with earnest concentration. The strangest moment came when they requested Pennsylvania polka, remembered Sergeant Donovan. 30 German soldiers and 30 Iowa farm girls spinning around the floor together, laughing at the speed of the music. I looked at my watch. Exactly the same time our boys were fighting house to house in French villages. How do you make sense of both things happening in the same world at the same moment? Nobody had a satisfactory answer. The incongruity remained, underscoring every interaction. Yet week after week, the dances continued, gradually becoming less extraordinary, more routine, a temporary normal within the abnormal circumstance of captivity. By midsummer, prisoners and local women greeted each other by name. Small courtesies developed, saved dances, remembered preferences, inside jokes that bridged language barriers. For the prisoners, these evenings provided more than entertainment. They offered glimpses into American life that contradicted everything they had been told. The women spoke freely about politics, complained about rationing, though German prisoners noted American rationing would be considered abundance in their homeland, and discussed their jobs in factories and offices. Such casual independence from women shocked prisoners raised in a society that increasingly emphasized traditional female roles. Even more revealing were offhand comments about American daily life, references to refrigerators in every home, multiple automobiles per family, regular meat consumption, and other details that painted a picture of prosperity inconceivable in wartime Germany. The prisoners compared these accounts with their own families' experiences, years of severe rationing, bombing raids, and increasing deprivation, and found the contrast devastating to their belief in German superiority. Fräulein Mary mentioned that her family complains about gasoline rationing. Werner Schmidt wrote in his camp diary, "They receive enough fuel for 20 miles of driving per week for non-essential travel. 20 miles! My father has not seen gasoline for his car since 1941. He keeps the vehicle on blocks in the barn." What kind of rationing is this, where ordinary citizens still drive automobiles for pleasure during wartime? Such revelations accumulated like raindrops, eventually forming rivers of doubt that eroded the foundations of their previous certainties. And still, the most profound shock awaited them. Not in the dance hall itself, but in what these social evenings revealed about the true nature of American power and the inevitable outcome of the war they had once believed they would win. The scale of American resources became impossible to ignore as prisoners spent more time working outside the camps. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be assigned non-military labor, and by 1944, German POWs worked throughout the American agricultural and manufacturing sectors, filling positions vacated by men serving overseas.
They harvested crops in vast fields, processed timber in lumber mills, packed food in canneries, and performed countless other tasks that kept the American economic engine running despite the absence of millions of men. What they witnessed during these assignments shattered remaining illusions about American capacity. A single Midwestern farm often covered more acreage than entire German villages. Factories operated 24 hours daily, producing goods not just for military use, but for civilian consumption. Infrastructure, roads, railways, telephone lines, electrical grids extended across distances that European minds struggled to comprehend. "Today, I harvested corn with a machine that does the work of 50 men," wrote Corporal Heinrich Müller after a work detail in Nebraska. The farmer who owns it has 3 such machines. He complained they are old models because new production is prioritized for military needs.
In his barn stand 2 automobiles, a tractor, and equipment that no German farmer has ever dreamed of possessing. This is an ordinary American farmer, not a wealthy man by their standards. The prisoners calculated the implications of what they observed. If one American farmer owned machinery equivalent to hundreds of German laborers, how could the Reich possibly match such productivity? If civilian consumption remained so high despite wartime restrictions, how vast must the true industrial capacity be? Most disturbing was the apparent ease with which America absorbed the economic demands of global war, while maintaining a standard of living that exceeded pre-war conditions in much of Europe. After work details, prisoners returned to camps where the evening dance might await, another demonstration of American excess. The refreshments alone told a story. Cookies made with real sugar, punch containing actual fruit juice, cigarettes distributed freely, items that had become distant memories in German households. The camp orchestra played instruments donated by local schools or civic groups, using electricity that never faltered, despite powering a recreational activity for enemy prisoners. Against this backdrop of material abundance, the weekly dances took on deeper significance. They represented not just social interaction, but a form of psychological warfare more effective than any propaganda. Without a single word of political indoctrination, America demonstrated its superiority through simple hospitality. The message was clear. A nation that could afford to treat prisoners with such generosity while fighting a 2-front global war possessed resources beyond anything Germany could mobilize. "We dance while our cities burn," Lieutenant Brenner remarked bitterly after hearing news of Allied bombing raids on Dresden. "They feed us cake while our families starve. This is not mercy, it is the ultimate display of power. They show us the world we cannot have, the abundance we can never match." Many prisoners began to understand that German defeat was inevitable, not primarily because of battlefield losses, but because the fundamental premise of the war had been false. Germany could never have defeated a nation with such overwhelming material advantages, regardless of tactical brilliance or fighting spirit. This realization spread through the camps, unspoken but increasingly acknowledged, undermining the ideological convictions that had sustained many through combat and capture. As summer turned to autumn, the dances continued, though with a different atmosphere. The initial novelty had faded, replaced by routine that somehow made the situation even more surreal in its normalcy. German prisoners no longer viewed these evenings as exceptional events, but as regular features of captivity, a normalization that itself revealed how completely they had adjusted to a reality that contradicted everything they once believed about America. The integration extended beyond Saturday nights. Prisoners with musical talent joined camp orchestras, playing not just for dances, but for Sunday concerts attended by guards and local visitors. German Christmas carols mingled with American holiday songs during December performances. Athletic competitions, soccer matches, track events, even boxing tournaments featured teams of prisoners competing against guards or local amateurs. What began as controlled social experiments became cultural exchange that humanized both sides. Guards who initially viewed prisoners with suspicion now recognized individuals with names, personalities, and stories. Prisoners who expected American barbarism discovered instead a complex society capable of treating enemies with unexpected dignity. Neither perspective erased the broader reality of a war still claiming lives across the ocean. But the daily interactions created a parallel truth that complicated simplistic narratives about good and evil. For 19-year-old Hans Müller, who had joined the Wehrmacht directly from Hitler Youth, the contradiction proved especially disorienting. His entire education had emphasized German cultural and racial superiority. America represented everything he had been taught to despise: democratic, diverse, materialistic, Jewish-influenced. Yet here he encountered an America that contradicted each stereotype: disciplined rather than chaotic, technologically advanced rather than primitive, generous rather than cruel. "I no longer know what to believe," he confessed to the camp chaplain during a counseling session. "If they lied about America, what else is untrue? My younger brother still fights on the Eastern Front, believing as I once did. He does not see what I have seen. He cannot know what I now know." This crisis of faith extended beyond politics to fundamental questions of identity. Who were they, if not the superior defenders of civilization they had believed themselves to be? What remained of their purpose if the ideological foundation crumbled beneath them? The prisoners found themselves caught between worlds, no longer fully part of the Germany that had shaped them, yet certainly not American, despite their immersion in its abundance. The weekly dances became stages where this identity conflict played out in subtle gestures and conversations. Some prisoners maintained rigid formality, treating the events as mere entertainment while internally rejecting American influence. Others embraced the opportunity, learning slang, adopting American dance styles, even developing friendships with regular dance partners. Most fell somewhere between, outwardly participating while inwardly struggling with what such participation might signify about their changing selves. Would you still believe in a cause when everything around you contradicted its central claims? Could you maintain faith in leaders whose predictions had proven so catastrophically wrong? The prisoners faced these questions not in abstract philosophical terms, but in immediate personal experience. Each dance, each conversation, each glimpse of American prosperity forced reconsideration of truths once held as absolute. By winter, news from Europe grew increasingly grim for Germany. Allied forces advanced from west and east, German cities lay in ruins, and rumors of ultimate defeat circulated even in censored communications. Against this backdrop, the camp dances acquired a bittersweet quality. Moments of warmth and humanity amid the collapse of the world the prisoners had known. The music played on as their homeland burned, creating a dissonance that none could fully reconcile. Yet in this impossible space between worlds, something unexpected emerged. Not forgiveness or absolution, but recognition of shared humanity that transcended the barriers of language, culture, and conflict. This recognition would outlast the war itself, shaping how many prisoners understood their experience long after returning to a transformed Germany. As Christmas approached, Camp 277 prepared for a special holiday dance. The recreation hall received extra decorations: pine branches, paper snowflakes, colored lights strung across wooden beams. The camp commander authorized additional refreshments and extended hours. For one evening, the boundaries between captors and captives would soften further, creating space for something almost like celebration, despite the shadow of war. Snow fell steadily outside as prisoners entered the hall, their breath visible in the cold Iowa air. Inside, warmth from wood stoves pushed back the winter chill. The gramophone played White Christmas, Bing Crosby's voice carrying a melancholy that resonated with everyone present, Americans and Germans alike, all separated from families during the holiday season, all longing for familiar traditions now distant in time and space. Ellen Richards, a 22-year-old nurse whose fiancé served in the Pacific, had attended these dances regularly since summer. Initially reluctant, she now greeted several prisoners by name, including Franz Weber, a former school teacher from Munich. Their conversations had evolved from awkward pleasantries to genuine exchanges about books, music, and eventually the war itself. Discussions possible only in the strange, neutral territory of the dance hall. "Will you have Christmas trees in Germany this year?" she asked as they danced, immediately regretting the question when she saw his expression change. "My mother writes that they will use a small branch only," he replied quietly. "No candles, blackout rules, no presents, nothing to buy. But they will sing carols, even with bombing." He hesitated, then added, "This is more Christmas than Germany has now. Lights, food, music. Strange to find Christmas in prison while home has none." The moment captured the fundamental irony of the prisoner's experience, finding abundance, even joy, in captivity while their homeland endured deprivation and destruction. For many, this inversion challenged everything they understood about victory and defeat. Were they the fortunate ones, safe in American camps with steady meals and Saturday dances? Or were they traitors, enjoying enemy hospitality while Germany suffered? The Christmas dance continued past midnight, the longest and most elaborate since the program began. The camp orchestra, now featuring several talented prisoners alongside American musicians, played carols in both languages. Silent Night, the melody identical though the words differed. Still a Night, mingling with English verses in an unplanned harmony that brought unexpected tears to many eyes. When the evening finally ended, prisoners returned to barracks through falling snow, carrying small gifts from their dance partners. Cookies wrapped in waxed paper, hand-knitted scarves, Christmas cards with personal messages. Guards who months earlier had maintained constant vigilance now walked casually alongside, sharing cigarettes and conversation as if the barbed wire between them had somehow become mere formality. Sergeant Donovan, watching this procession from the doorway of the guard post, reflected on the transformation he had witnessed. These men had arrived as enemies, hardened by combat and indoctrination. Now they moved through American snow, singing Christmas carols, carrying gifts from American women, their identities forever altered by months of immersion in a culture they had been taught to despise. The war continued elsewhere, brutal and uncompromising, but here in this isolated Iowa camp, something different had emerged. Not peace exactly, but perhaps its distant relative. "Silent Night," Donovan murmured, watching the last prisoners disappear into their barracks. "Holy Night." The words seemed both prayer and observation, acknowledging something sacred in this temporary truce, this fragile moment of connection across the divides of nation, ideology, and war. The dances at Camp 277 and hundreds of other prisoner-of-war camps across America continued until Germany's surrender in May 1945. In the aftermath of victory, the program's purpose shifted from maintaining order to preparing prisoners for eventual repatriation. Educational components increased. English lessons, American history classes, democratic principles explained in group discussions. The social events remained, but now served as preparation for re-entry into a post-war world where Germany would need to rebuild relationships with former enemies. For many prisoners, returning home proved more difficult than capture had been. They left an America of abundance for a Germany in ruins. Cities reduced to rubble, economies shattered, populations traumatized by defeat and revelation of Nazi atrocities. The contrast between what they had experienced in captivity and what awaited them created a reverse culture shock more severe than their initial adjustment to American camps.
I find myself unable to describe America to my family, wrote Hans Müller after repatriation. They cannot comprehend a place where prisoners received meat daily while German civilians starved. They believe I exaggerate or have been brainwashed. Perhaps both are partly true.
I no longer know myself what reality is. The America I experienced, or the Germany I was taught to believe in. Many former prisoners carried unexpected souvenirs from captivity, snapshots taken at camp dances, addresses of American dance partners with whom some maintained correspondence for years, English phrases and American songs that remained when other wartime memories faded. More significantly, they carried perspectives transformed by direct exposure to American society at a time when most Germans had access only to propaganda images. These men became involuntary bridges between cultures in post-war reconstruction. Some served as translators for occupation authorities. Others applied American agricultural techniques they had learned during work details. A few eventually immigrated to the United States, drawn back by connections formed during those improbable dance hall evenings. The dances themselves acquired almost mythical status in later retellings, impossibly wholesome moments amid global destruction, evidence that humanity could persist even between sworn enemies. Former guards and prisoners occasionally reunited at veterans events decades later, exchanging memories of camp orchestras and Christmas celebrations that seemed increasingly dreamlike as years passed. What remained most vivid for many was not specific dances, but the gradual revelation of American abundance that the social programs had revealed. The casual displays of prosperity, electricity used for entertainment, gasoline for transporting dance partners, sugar for cookies when German civilians used sawdust to extend flour, demonstrated American power more effectively than any military parade could have done. "We lost the war before it began," Karl Brenner told his grandchildren years later. "Not because Americans fought better, though they fought well, but because we never understood what we faced. Their greatest weapon was not the bomb, but the refrigerator. Not the tank, but the automobile in every driveway. How could Germany, with all its discipline and sacrifice, defeat a nation that could feed its enemies better than we fed our soldiers?" The dance program remained classified for years after the war, deemed too controversial for public discussion when memories of combat losses remained raw. Gradually, historians uncovered details, interviewing former prisoners and guards, examining camp records and personal diaries preserved despite regulations against keeping them. What emerged was not a simple narrative of rehabilitation or propaganda, but a complex human story. Enemies becoming reluctant dance partners, while death continued elsewhere. Cultural exchange occurring alongside ongoing conflict. Perhaps the most profound legacy of these improbable evenings was their demonstration that connection remained possible even at history's darkest moment. Between gramophone songs and awkward conversation, Germans and Americans discovered their shared humanity, not erasing the war's horrors, but existing alongside them, complicating the neat categories of ally and enemy, good and evil, victor and vanquished. The last dance at Camp 277 occurred the weekend before prisoners began returning to Europe. The recreation hall, scene of so many unlikely encounters, hosted a final evening that many approached with complex emotions. Relief at war's end, mingling with uncertainty about what awaited them in defeated Germany. Gratitude for humane treatment, competing with shame over their nation's actions. The gramophone played one last time, American songs now familiar to German ears, rhythms and melodies that had become part of their captivity experience. Prisoners and local women who had attended regularly, exchanged addresses, made promises to write, spoke of possible reunions in peacetime that most knew would never occur. When the final song ended, Old Lang Syne, chosen deliberately for its message of remembrance, the hall fell silent. German and American voices had joined in the chorus, though most prisoners didn't understand the words they sang. The meaning transcended language. Old acquaintances not forgotten, hands clasped across divides once thought unbridgeable, connections forged in the strangest of circumstances. As they filed out for the last time, many glanced back at the empty dance floor. the space where enemies had become, if not friends, then something more complicated than the war had allowed them to be. The music ended, the hall darkened, but the questions raised by those improbable evenings continued to resonate about human connection in times of conflict, about the possibility of seeing the individual beyond the uniform, and about finding unexpected harmony in the midst of a war at war. The next time you hear swing music from the 1940s, perhaps pause to imagine those unlikely dance partners, German prisoners and American women moving across wooden floors in Iowa gymnasiums and Texas recreation halls, creating brief moments of connection while armies clashed an ocean away. Their story reminds us that even in humanity's darkest chapters, we occasionally find grace notes, unexpected measures of shared rhythm that suggest, however fleetingly, the possibility of harmony beyond the discord of conflict.